Just 300 years ago, a tiny island nation, smaller than the state of Oregon, controlled nearly a quarter of the entire planet. 1 out of every 4 people on Earth lived under the British flag. From the frozen shores of Canada to the burning deserts of Australia, from the spice markets of India to the diamond mines of South Africa, all of it belonged to Britain. At its peak, the British Empire was so massive that when the sun set in one corner of the empire, it was already rising in another. They called it the empire on which the sun never sets. But here's the crazy part. It all started with a group of Viking raiders who invaded a small island over 1,000 years ago. So how did Britain go from being conquered by foreign invaders to conquering the world? And why did the mightiest empire in human history crumble in less than 50 years? This is the incredible story of rise, power, greed, rebellion, and the dramatic collapse of the British Empire. Let's go back to 1066. England wasn't even called England yet. It was a collection of warring kingdoms constantly under attack. Then came William the Conqueror and his Norman army. They didn't just invade England, they transformed it. The Normans brought something the English had never seen before, a hunger for expansion beyond their shores. Fast forward to 1485. Henry VII sits on the English throne, and he's watching with envy as Spain and Portugal divide up the New World between themselves. Spanish ships return loaded with Aztec gold. Portuguese traders bring back exotic spices worth more than their weight in silver. Henry VII realizes that if England wants to survive, it needs to get in on this game. But England had one massive problem. It was broke. While Spain had the riches of South America and Portugal controlled the spice trade, England was still a backward farming nation. So Henry VII made a brilliant move. Instead of funding exploration with royal money he didn't have, he gave permission to private merchants and adventurers to sail under the English flag. If they made money, England would take a cut. If they died at sea, well, that wasn't the king's problem. This created something unique, a nation of merchant warriors. English sailors weren't just explorers, they were businessmen with cannons. They built the Royal Navy not just to fight wars, but to protect trade routes and steal from competitors. The English had 3 simple goals that would drive them for the next 400 years: find new trade routes, spread Christianity, and conquer anyone who stood in their way. But they were about to discover something that would change everything. Sometimes the best way to build an empire isn't through grand battles, but through a single trading company. England's first colony wasn't across an ocean. It was right next door in Ireland. Starting in the 1170s, English nobles began carving up Irish land like a Thanksgiving turkey. They brought English settlers, built English castles, and forced Irish people to live under English law. Ireland became England's testing ground for everything they would later do around the world. But the real game-changer came in 1607 with a small settlement called Jamestown in what would become Virginia. Unlike the Spanish, who sent conquistadors to grab gold and run, the English sent families to stay. They planted tobacco, built towns, and created something the world had never seen: permanent colonies designed to send wealth back to the homeland forever. Around the same time, a group of London merchants formed the East India Company. On paper, it looked like just another trading business. In reality, it would become the most powerful corporation in human history. The East India Company didn't just trade with India, it conquered India, one port city at a time. Here's how clever they were. Instead of invading India directly, They played local rulers against each other. They would offer to help one Indian prince fight another, and in return, they wanted just a small trading post, then another, then another. Before anyone realized what was happening, the East India Company controlled entire regions of India with their own private army. By 1700, England had something no other European power possessed: a network of permanent colonies that kept growing and generating wealth year after year. The Spanish Empire was built on plundering gold. The English Empire was built on something far more powerful: addiction to English goods and dependence on English trade. The 1700s were when Britain truly showed its fangs to the world. British ships appeared everywhere: the Caribbean, West Africa, North America, India, even the remote islands of the Pacific. But this expansion came with a dark secret that would stain British history forever. The British discovered that their American colonies had perfect conditions for growing tobacco, cotton, and sugar. But these crops required massive amounts of workers. The solution was slavery on an industrial scale. British ships created a triangle of misery: manufactured goods from Britain to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to America, and raw materials from America back to Britain. Over 300 years, British slave traders transported more than 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The profits were so enormous that they helped fund Britain's rise to global dominance. Liverpool, Bristol, and London became wealthy cities, built on the backs of enslaved people thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, in India, the East India Company was pulling off the greatest corporate takeover in history. After winning the Battle of Plassey in 1757, they basically owned Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world. Imagine if Amazon decided to become a country. That's essentially what the East India Company did. The British also began their conquest of Australia in 1788, turning it into a giant prison colony. They shipped convicted criminals from overcrowded British jails to the other side of the world, where they were forced to build a new British society from scratch. Canada fell under British control after defeating France in 1763. Suddenly, Britain controlled a continuous stretch of territory from the Arctic Circle to the Caribbean Sea. Here's where Britain gained an advantage that would make them unstoppable for the next 150 years. While the rest of the world was still making things by hand, Britain figured out how to mass-produce everything using machines powered by coal and steam. The Industrial Revolution didn't happen by accident. It was fueled by the British Empire. Raw materials flowed in from the colonies: cotton from America, iron ore from India, wool from Australia. British factories turned these materials into finished goods, then sold them back to the colonies at huge profits. But the real game changer was transportation. British engineers built the world's first railway networks and steam-powered ships. Suddenly, British troops could move across India in days instead of months. British goods could reach any port in the world, faster and cheaper than anyone else's. The Royal Navy became an unstoppable force. By 1850, Britain had more warships than the next three largest navies combined. They controlled every major shipping route in the world. If you wanted to trade across the oceans, you needed British permission. This created a cycle that made Britain richer and more powerful every year. Industrial production generated wealth, which funded a bigger navy, which protected more trade routes, which brought in more raw materials, which fed more factories. Britain had become the first truly global supermarket, and they owned all the stores. After defeating Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, Britain entered what historians call Pax Britannica, British peace. For nearly 100 years, Britain was so powerful that they could prevent major wars just by showing up. Queen Victoria became the symbol of this incredible power. During her reign from 1837 to 1901, the British Empire reached its absolute peak. The numbers are staggering. 25% of all land on Earth, 400 million people, colonies on every continent except Antarctica. The empire was so vast that at any given moment it was daytime somewhere in British territory. From Canada in the west to Australia in the east, the sun literally never set on British soil. London became the center of the world. All global trade routes led through British-controlled ports. But here's what made British power truly terrifying. They didn't just control territory, they controlled the global economy. The British pound became the world's currency. If you wanted to buy or sell anything internationally, you probably needed British banks, British ships, and British insurance. British culture spread everywhere. English became the language of international business. British laws became the foundation for legal systems around the world. British sports like cricket and football spread to every corner of the empire. The British convinced themselves they were bringing civilization to the world. They built railways, schools, and hospitals in their colonies. But there was always a catch. Everything was designed to benefit Britain first. By the mid-1800s, people in the colonies were getting tired of being ruled by a country thousands of miles away. The first major rebellion came in India in 1857, and it shocked the British to their core. Indian soldiers in the British Army heard rumors that their rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, sacred to Hindus and forbidden to Muslims. When they refused to use the cartridges, British officers had them executed. This sparked a massive uprising across northern India. For over a year, British control of India hung by a thread. Entire British communities were massacred. Indian rebels captured Delhi and declared the restoration of the Mughal Empire. The British response was brutal. They executed rebels by tying them to cannons and blowing them apart. The rebellion failed, but it changed everything. The British realized they couldn't rule 300 million Indians with just 40,000 British soldiers unless those Indians wanted to be ruled. The easy days of empire were over. In South Africa, the British fought two devastating wars against Dutch settlers called Boers between 1899 and 1902. These weren't colonial subjects. These were white Europeans who fought with modern weapons and guerrilla tactics. The British won, but only by inventing concentration camps where 26,000 Boer women and children died of disease and starvation. Back in Ireland, rebels were demanding independence with increasing violence. The British discovered that ruling white Christians who spoke English was just as difficult as ruling anyone else. When World War I began in 1914, the British thought it would be over by Christmas. They had no idea they were about to begin the process of destroying their own empire. The war was a meat grinder that consumed an entire generation of young British men. Over 700,000 British soldiers died, and the war cost so much money that Britain had to borrow heavily from the United States. For the first time in 200 years, Britain owed more money than they could easily repay. But the real damage was to British prestige. The empire had always been built on the idea that British civilization was superior to everyone else's. But how superior could you be if you needed help from America to defeat Germany? How civilized could you be after sending millions of men to die in muddy trenches? Worse yet, the British had promised independence to several colonies in exchange for their help in the war. Canada, Australia, and South Africa had sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to die for Britain. In return, they expected to be treated as equal partners, not colonial subjects. The British tried to go back to business as usual after 1918, but the magic was gone. Everyone had seen that the British Empire could be defeated, could go bankrupt, and could beg for help from former colonies. World War II didn't just damage the British Empire, it killed it. Britain survived the war, but only by mortgaging everything they owned to the United States. The humiliation began immediately. In 1941, Japanese forces conquered Hong Kong, Singapore, and Burma with shocking ease. British generals had always claimed that Asian armies couldn't match European military skill. The Japanese proved them catastrophically wrong. Singapore was supposed to be an impregnable fortress, the key to British power in Asia. It fell in just 1 week. Over 130,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered, the largest surrender in British military history. Across Asia, colonized peoples watched their supposed masters get defeated by other Asians. Britain's financial situation was even worse. By 1945, the country was essentially bankrupt. They owed the United States over $4 billion, roughly $60 billion in today's money. Britain had to choose between maintaining the empire and rebuilding their homeland. They couldn't afford both. The war had also changed global politics forever. The new superpowers were the United States and Soviet Union, both of whom opposed European colonialism for different reasons. America wanted free trade and open markets. The Soviets supported anti-colonial communist movements. Britain found itself isolated and pressured from all sides. The end came faster than anyone expected. In 1947, Britain simply gave up and granted independence to India and Pakistan. After 200 years of rule over the subcontinent, they just walked away. The partition of India was one of the most violent events in human history. Over 1 million people died as Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs turned on each other in communal riots. 12 million people became refugees overnight. British officials had drawn the borders carelessly, creating problems that still cause wars today. But Britain had no choice. They couldn't afford to keep 100,000 troops in India, and they couldn't govern 400 million people who no longer wanted to be governed. The jewel in the crown of the British Empire was gone. The collapse accelerated from there. In 1948, Britain withdrew from Palestine, leaving behind a civil war between Jews and Arabs. In 1956, they tried to recapture the Suez Canal from Egypt and suffered a humiliating defeat when the United States forced them to retreat. Suez was the moment the world realized Britain was no longer a superpower. A small Middle Eastern country had successfully defied the British Empire, and there was nothing Britain could do about it. Across Africa, independence movements gained momentum. Ghana became independent in 1957, followed by Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and dozens of other colonies. By the 1960s, Britain was granting independence to multiple colonies every year. The British Empire officially ended on July 1, 1997, when Britain handed Hong Kong back to China. It was a strange, quiet ceremony, no battles, no declarations, just a flag being lowered and another raised. Hong Kong had been British for 156 years, longer than most American states had been American. But the lease was up. China was now powerful enough to take it back, and Britain was too weak to resist. The last governor of Hong Kong sailed away on the royal yacht Britannia. When the yacht returned to Britain, it was immediately decommissioned and turned into a museum. The symbolism was perfect. The age of British global power was over. What remained was the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of former British colonies. But this was empire in name only. Britain had no power over these countries and little influence on their policies. The British Empire is gone, but its influence remains everywhere. Walk through any major city in the world, and you'll see the British legacy. English became the global language not because it's easy to learn, but because the British Empire forced hundreds of millions of people to use it. Today, English is the language of international business, science, and the internet. British legal systems still operate in dozens of countries. The idea of common law, trial by jury, and innocent until proven guilty spread across the world through British colonization. Cricket is played from India to the Caribbean. Football, soccer, is the world's most popular sport because British workers and soldiers taught it everywhere they went. Even the metric measurements most countries use were often introduced by British colonial governments. The global financial system still centers on institutions created by the British Empire. Insurance markets, central banking, and international trade rules all have British origins. The English legacy isn't entirely positive. Former British colonies are still dealing with problems the empire created. The British drew colonial borders based on their own convenience, not on local ethnic or tribal boundaries. This created artificial countries like Iraq, Nigeria, and Sudan, which have been torn apart by civil wars ever since independence. The British often favored one ethnic group over others in their colonies, creating tensions that exploded into violence after independence. The Rwandan genocide, the partition of India, and conflicts across Africa all have roots in British colonial policies. Many former colonies are demanding reparations for centuries of exploitation. They point out that Britain got rich by stealing their resources and forcing their people into poverty. Some are demanding the return of cultural artifacts stolen during the colonial period. The British Museum in London contains treasures looted from around the world: Egyptian mummies, Greek sculptures, Indian jewels, African masks. Countries like Greece, Egypt, and India want their heritage returned, but Britain refuses to give back most items. There's also the question of responsibility for slavery and its aftermath. The British transported millions of enslaved people and profited enormously from their labor. Caribbean nations argue that Britain owes them compensation for centuries of unpaid work. The rise and fall of the British Empire teaches us several important lessons about power and its limits. First, no empire lasts forever. The British Empire seemed invincible in 1900, but it was gone by 1960. Empires fall when they become too expensive to maintain, and when the people they rule no longer accept their authority. Second, technology and economics matter more than military might. Britain dominated the world not just because they had good soldiers, but because they had better ships, factories, and financial systems than anyone else. Third, empires always carry the seeds of their own destruction. The British taught their colonial subjects English, educated them in British universities, and exposed them to British ideas about freedom and democracy. Then they acted surprised when these same people used British concepts to demand independence from Britain. Finally, the legacy of empire outlasts the empire itself. The British Empire ended decades ago, but its influence on language, law, culture, and global politics continues to shape our world today. The British Empire was one of the most successful imperial projects in human history. At its peak, it was larger and more powerful than the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, or any other empire before or since. But like all empires, it was ultimately temporary, a few centuries in the long story of human civilization. Today, Britain is just another medium-sized European country, struggling with economic problems and political divisions like everyone else. The sun has finally set on the British Empire, and it will never rise again. If you found this incredible story of rise, power, and collapse fascinating, smash that like button and let me know in the comments which part of British imperial history shocked you the most. Was it the scale of the slave trade, the brutal response to the Indian Rebellion, or the speed with which the entire empire collapsed after World War II? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell because we've got more amazing historical stories coming your way. Next week, we're diving into the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, another incredible tale of power, conquest, and ultimate decline. Share this video with anyone who loves history or wants to understand how our modern world was shaped by the empires of the past. The story of the British Empire isn't just ancient history. It explains why English is the global language, why certain countries have ongoing conflicts, and why the world economy works the way it does today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.